It's now my pleasure to introduce the next panel. So we've got the ever fabulous and effervescent Georgie Aley from KPMG, who's going to be moderating this session. And if I could invite Louise, Michael, Feyi, John and another Michael to the stage, then that would be wonderful. Please join me in welcoming the panel to talk about the global approach.
Thank you, Catherine, and we'll just get ourselves organised. So Georgie Aley, as Catherine said, from KPMG's Food and Agribusiness Consulting Team, and of course a very proud partner of the National Farmers Federation, and my panel's left me cold. Thank you, Michael. I'll slide down. There we go. Are we on that one? There we are. Yeah, I'll come for a bit more warmth. So I think, look, Michael, that was a fantastic introduction and scene setting for what we're going to talk about in this panel. And this panel is focused on, of course, the global approach and the key point here around diversification of markets. So I think we're in for a really good discussion. And I think as we look towards 2030 and achieving a $100 billion sector, and you so rightly pointed out, the need for strong export markets, but also very strong trade relations are crucial. And anyone that's anybody watching politics this week, trade has of course been front and centre. So this week alone, we've seen the official ratification of the TPP that's just been cleared through the Senate, and Australia of course being the fourth nation to ratify. The Australian Embassy potential move to Jerusalem, and Fiona, on behalf of the NFF, came out very strong in raising the concern that the sector may have on how this will impact some of our trade relations. And then as of course we look to the beef exports, there's discussion that it's reaching the Brexit crunch point, and MLA coming out very strong, urging Britain and the EU to decide on tariff quotas. So politics and policy is really having a pressure on our industry. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion across our panel, and we've got a great group of panellists here to talk about this topic today. Now, we will take questions from the audience, and I'm sure Michael has stirred a lot of questions amongst the crowd, so we'll work our way through, but please put your hand up, and if I miss you, just wave as hard as you can. But I will throw to our panellists to provide their own introduction and maybe their initial thoughts and comments, of course, on the topic of global approach. And Michael, given you just gave a very wonderful scene-setting presentation just then, I might start with you.
Thanks. I mean, obviously, I've just spoken for a long time, so I'll keep it short. Just one other way to try and frame the same thing I've just said, because when you talk about politics, sometimes, people want to do the three monkeys approach and just, avoid the whole topic. That doesn't make it go away, first of all. But I think we actually need to wrap this up within the envelope of sustainability, because obviously we've been talking about sustainability a lot here today already, and within Rabobank we talk about it a lot. And I'm no farmer. I want to make that very, very clear. As you've probably seen, farming is not what I do. It's higher level stuff in terms of helicopter view. But when you farm, we're all aware of the fact that you can do it cheap and nasty. Nasty, cheap chemicals, et cetera, really destroy the environment, and you will make more money for a year or two. And in the long run, you've ruined your farm, you've ruined your reputation, you've ruined your national reputation. So we all know you can make more money doing X, but it doesn't work in the long run. I put it to you, the same thing's true from a geopolitical or international trade with a politics slant. You can make more money selling to country X for quite a few years. What good does it do you if in 5 years you're absolutely stuffed by doing that? Would it not be better to make, say, 10, 15% less selling to country Y, knowing that that's a market that will be sustainable for the next 100 years or something, or as far ahead as one can look? So, same argument, trying to maybe wrap it up in a slightly different wrapper that might be more palatable.
I think that's a very good remark, and I'm sure there are some producers in the audience who might want to ask you some questions on that one specifically. Louise, I might hand over to you.
I suppose from the Australian government point of view, we are, I suppose, in some ways aligned with what Michael is saying. We're all about diversification in markets and trying to ensure that we open, maintain or improve markets. So it's really around the point about diversification, sustainability is so important. The free trade agreements are really important from our point of view because they're a mechanism to understand a particular country or number of countries and to work through a rules-based way of operating, taking into point some points Michael made as well, but they are our mechanism. Lots of countries around the world use them. Australia has used them to our advantage, so we've got Japan, Korea and China, which has given us significant advantage. TPP 11 has just been ratified. It's very significant. We do have partners within those within the TPP, but we've got now new partners, which is Canada and Mexico. So looking for opportunities are really important for the Australian government. The Department of Agriculture and Water Resources is there to their core business. Our core business is to make sure we actually diversify and maintain and open those markets. We're there really also to make sure that those protocols are developed. It's not just about reducing tariffs, it's actually around non-tariff barriers, and I think most of the audience that are dealing with exports know about those. It's how we reduce those, developing the relationships in country to make sure we can actually argue our points. When those tariffs come down, it seems that more and more, because of the way the environment, and Michael was talking about it, around protectionism and globalisation, they become more and more important. So it's really important for us to be there with industry and tackle those so that we can actually maintain or improve those markets, let alone growing those markets. So for us, it really is about diversification and making sure that our industries are able to grow into that $100 billion mark. For me also, it's also about, and I take Michael's points, but it's also about making sure we're engaged in the rules-based trading system. Australia continues to have to drive that. We're a very small economy, but we export 2/3 of our product. So we've got to make sure that we're in that game and that we're in, as a middle power, influencing where we can and making sure that we're trying to ensure those rules-based systems continue to operate. We also, the Australian government continues to put money into that. From the point of view of exports, $51 million in the last budget, which went to increasing our agriculture experts' footprint around the world from 16 to 22, and also from our technical capacity within the Department of Agriculture to work with industry to make sure we can reduce those barriers, which we call non-tariff barriers. So those are the sorts of things we're trying to do within the Australian government, with the Department of Foreign Affairs and various partners within the industry to make sure we actually open those markets, maintain them, let alone growing them.
And Louise, I will be interested in your comments a little bit later in the discussion around, you know, the role between government and industry and how better maybe industry can work with government. We know the NFF do a great job and their member organisations do a great job, but I will be interested in some comments from you on maybe how we can strengthen that, given the importance of diversifying. Look, John, from your end.
Yep, certainly. Okay, thank you. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity. For those that don't know me in the room, my name is John Colley. I'm the Managing Director, the Foundation Managing Director of Australian Wool Network. I have been in the wool industry for 37 years. I come from rural Australia very much, still have significant investments in rural Australia. We are a wool broker, a wool trader. We're also a wool manufacturer and an exporter, and we run a retail operation as well. We are fully integrated. And in my spare time, I'm President of the National Council of Wool Selling Brokers of Australia and a Director of the Australian Wool Exchange. I'm also a member representative at Australian Wool Testing Authority. So my whole life has been dedicated to the wool industry. And before I go on, I'd just like to congratulate very much the last presenter, on the thought that's gone into what you've actually put up there on screen. Having spent an enormous amount of time in China over the last 25 years and watched it develop from a commercial perspective, how Australia deals with China and how it goes forward is a pivotal, we're at a key point right here. And it changed dramatically with the event of the Cold War that was spoken about so heavily here. I was actually in China when they imposed the tariffs on the wool exports through to the USA. And within the wool industry, the ripples were, what does that actually mean and how are we going to cope with it if they're not actually exporting Australian wool made products in China through to the USA. The reality of it is when we actually look at those statistics, there's less than 1% of the woolen products that are exported through to the USA in finished form. So we don't think it's going to affect the market in any way at all. China is now consuming most of the wool internally itself. So we have a very different situation to the rest of the commodities. Most of the wool, if you go back 15 years in the industry, we were selling 80% of our wool to China. They were manufacturing it and they were exporting it to the rest of the world. Now what they're doing is it's being consumed internally. And for us, that's actually a really good thing. So I think that we're in a slightly different situation to everybody else, but it's one that we watch every day. Would we like to have 80% of our wool going to one country? The answer is no. Has the industry worldwide been able to counter that? The answer is no, they haven't been able to. The Europeans have not been able to compete. The Japanese, the Koreans, everywhere where the wool has been processed, we have not been able to compete with the Chinese. But now they've got their head around the fact that they like the product and they want to use it internally. It's a good thing for us.
Great. Now, no stranger to the NFF family, Feyi. So interested very much on your thoughts.
Thank you. And I'd also like to echo Michael. Wow, thanks. You're depressing.
I get that a lot.
Yeah. The Newgate, as you know, is a communications firm founded in Australia, and we have offices in Europe and Asia and throughout the world. So we spend a lot of time helping our clients navigate their environment from a communications perspective. And this is a map that we're putting, and I personally am heavily involved in international political areas. This is a map of the current globe, and I only did one place in Africa because once you get into Africa it became ridiculously scary, talking to the world that Australia trades with, and the red are those that are currently led by a popular leader. The pink are those who have emerging influential parties making up coalitions within government. The purple are where there's popular leaders coming and who are currently in the next 12 months having an election. The orange is where there is just out and out military control. And the blue are those people who have crazy neighbours.
I'm worried, though. I'm worried.
And we're in the blue. We're very much in the blue.
You're insulting New Zealand there.
No, well, they're not blue. They're just kind of like got a really interesting leader, and God, I hope she makes it through. But this is an example of populism and its impact from another perspective, because the characteristics of popular leaders are they believe in the people and not in the elites, and everybody in this room is an elite. They are anti-institutions, that's domestic and global. They believe in demonising a minority sector of their population as an excuse for infringement of human rights, and they believe in using terrorism as an excuse for an infringement of human rights. Does it sound familiar? Last time the world looked like this was the 1930s. We got hyper competitiveness and devaluation. We got a ramping up of punitive tariffs. Does it sound familiar? And we ended up in a Second World War. Now, Michael's called it a trade war, and it's going to come to a point where I'll take a trade war over the other version.
Sorry, can I jump in for a second?
Right.
I completely agree. I love this chart. I think that's a very, very pertinent observation. I agree too. When I actually give this presentation and people say, wow, I'm depressing, I also say I would happily take a trade war or a Cold War over, the alternatives, which are ticking out there. Do I get my chart? I think I've got one slide that might come up that I sent too.
Feel free.
I'm not quite sure if it will come up.
See, hyper-competitiveness.
No, just because it leads on from that very beautifully.
Have we got a chart for Michael?
Oh, there was one slide I sent to, maybe not, okay.
Maybe not.
Basically, it speaks to your slide, sir, and what you put there. There we go. When we talk about global trade, this is the uncomfortable part, and this is very depressing. Anybody who's ever studied economics, at some point you'll have learned about David Ricardo, this gentleman here, who basically invented what we call free trade. He came up with the idea, and he basically said, look, here's the example of England and Portugal. Sorry if you studied this in university. And that's how many hours of work it takes to produce 1 unit of cloth or wine, because it was a very simple economy back in the early 19th century. And you can see that Portugal is actually better at making cloth and wine than England. But he said, look, if you specialise, England makes the cloth and Portugal makes the wine, mathematically, you're actually making more in less time in total, and then you trade together. Now, that may look, okay, you might get maybe going cross-eyed. That's your argument for free trade. The problem is, look at the quote underneath that is never included in every economics textbook that talks about Ricardo. Underneath he says, well, yes, but obviously everybody would be better off if Portugal actually did everything than what I'm proposing. But that will never happen because, quote, men of property will be satisfied with a low rate of profit in their own country rather than a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations. So effectively, David Ricardo's intellectual foundation for the free trade politicians and business people are constantly pushing for is a false foundation if you have international movement of capital. If you can basically invest in another country and move your factory there, it ends up with this breaking down nastily, which, to link in, is why it did break down last time.
So then, Michael, on that point, should we be listening to the optimists or the pessimists?
Well, both, because both have got good arguments to make. History is deeply pessimistic. In fact, John, you said that we go back to free trade. If you actually look at the long-run history of global trade, and it's boring and, real old style, it's thousands of years old, thousands of years of trading. We've had 100 and something, maybe 110 years of free trade in a 5,000-year history, and both of them ended up with a World War.
Yeah.
World War I, and then again World War II. So the track record of free trade is patchy at best,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yep.
I don't say that with any happiness.
Look, if I can just say, I understand, and I understand the economic point of view. I've actually heard, I have a very close friend who's an investment banker who expounded exactly the same theory as you did to me here the other day. And he was managing director of the largest Chinese investment here in Australia. And it's been an extremely interesting thing watching how we actually deal with it. If you look at Australia, we're very young. We're only 200 years young. We're of European settlement, and probably within 5 generations, and I can be corrected on that, we will be probably 90% of Asian origin from where we come. That's what's going to happen. So the actual makeup of the Australian population and how we actually evolve over the next 30 years, it's going to change dramatically, whether or not we like it or not. And it started some time ago. It started a long time ago, back in the 50s, and it's continuing to go. And whether we like it or not, we can either embrace it and be part of it, or we can fight against it. And the two schools of thought about the protectionism and what that does, I hear you. In a commercial world where I come from, every day of my life, in the short term, we have to develop the markets in Asia and develop other areas to get our products to actually be consumed elsewhere. We're very small in the world scale here.
I suppose I'd just add to that in that I'd probably take more of an optimistic view in that, yes, I totally understand the sort of economic environment, but we continue to look at what potential markets, and I just hear what Michael was saying before on where we might diversify markets. Now, if you look at the under development of our exports into India, the potential there is enormous. And yes, we've had some concerns recently around domestic, I suppose, trade policy settings on pulses and sugar in India. But, pulse exports to India is over $1 billion from Australia, so it's in a significant market. So the issue is, how do you engage with India? And we've got the Australian government Indian economic strategy, and it's a long-term and it's a hard work investment, but the potential in that market is huge, and just because of a hiccup along the way, and we're not particularly happy about how it was done, but for us this is a long-term market, and we need to work with industry. Your point before, Georgie, about how do we engage with industry and government in the next decade, because that's the sort of thing we've got to try and do to counter what Michael's talking about as well.
And with a little bit of bias with my involvement in Pulse Australia, we've been very embracing of that economic report and the opportunity for Australia to particularly build the Pulse's exports into India in a long-term and sustainable fashion. Now, we'll just reiterate, we're keen to take questions from the audience, and I feel this panel is one that would be open to controversy and engage in a very insightful discussion. So please, if you do have a question, grab a microphone. They are floating around. We do have one at the front. While the microphone's coming to this table at the front, please stand up so while the microphone makes its way to you. Feyi, I just want to come back to you on a point. you know, we're at the National Farmers Federation Congress, our peak group representing the farming community. So with all this comment around, you know, the challenges of our trading markets and our environment, how do producer groups meaningfully communicate when countries are blowing themselves up?
It's a good question. And I wouldn't necessarily say we're not amongst those attempting to blow ourselves up. It's just a bit harder to get the dynamite under the ground. I would suggest, and I say this with love, here in the Festival of Dougals, a bit of cultural bias in ag needs to be overcome. Mm-hmm. There is a very Anglo-Saxon attitude to trade and going with cultures and countries that are easier, where in actual fact there's far more potential with disrupting ourselves a little bit more and actually being prepared to communicate with people whose first language might not be English. There is a lot of opportunity mentioned out of India, fastest growing Commonwealth nation, fastest growing non-China US nation, fastest youngest nation. There's a lot of opportunity still out of Japan, third biggest economy in the world. There is a lot of opportunity out of Indonesia, and Malaysia now has a government we can talk to again. There is so much opportunity on our doorstep that we might not have to pick a winner in the bigger elephant war. We can just kind of like hang around and play with hippos. Hungry hippos. But the things that need to be overcome is a willingness to develop personal relationships with partners, and also a willingness to come together for a single brand. I mean, we've all seen the success of the New Zealanders.
If we have time, I definitely do. And I think you've just reiterated a lot of the comments yesterday in our panel around inclusion and diversity for this industry, not just around gender, but around culture.
Apologies to anybody called Dougal out there.
Well, I think the Dougals are fading these days, Feyi. Question, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Just as an aside, Feyi, hippos are actually responsible for way more human deaths than elephants are.
That's true.
I'm Charlie Perrell. I'm the Deputy Chair of a group called Farmers for Climate Action. I'm standing because I wanted to give you a standing ovation for your presentation, Michael. It was awe-inspiring.
10 minutes too late.
Thank you, comrade.
And also I take on board the comments in relation to rampant free trade leading directly to conflict at major levels. We've just had a presentation in relation to managing drought in this country, or responding to drought. And your presentation on a global scale is on a similar theme, and then Feyi's map, global map, which I agree with you, it's frightening, but at least I'm wondering whether we should be red rather than blue at the moment. But now my question is, overarching all of those presentations, the two words climate change have not been mentioned once. How are we as a global population going to respond to this threat under the scenario that was outlined by Michael, that is serious, in a way that we can address that challenge? Because in my opinion, that is a challenge that is even greater than the threat of major conflict.
Very simple answer. I do get asked that one occasionally. Star Trek or Star Wars? Basically, if you go to the Star Trek scenario, the threat that we're going to have to global resources is going to cause all this tension to just melt away. Everyone's going to unite around, a one world vision. It'll be as multilateral as you can imagine. The United Nations sets up some great scheme, and everyone chips in together, and we together overcome the problem. Or we have evil empires, grabbing what they can and oppressing people and making sure that they can eat when other people can't. And those are your two possible bookends, if you will. You've got one or the other, and I can't tell you which one's going to happen, but it's going to be one or the other, or some sliding spectrum between the two. And it's up to you individually and as an audience to think which one's more likely. It changes day by day.
Great. The boss that needs no introduction, Tony.
Thank you, Georgie. I've got two quick questions. One is, how long can we keep using the free trade words? It's not been free trade. It probably hasn't ever been free trade. So what lifespan has free trade got? And secondly, perhaps to Louise, your comment about the rules-based system. If I was going to use some of Michael's vernacular, I'd say niet. Really, is that really a thing, the rules-based system? And how long can we keep believing that as well? If we're talking about India and Thailand and all of these countries that supposedly, and China as well, are in the WTO, and we keep relying on that magic pudding.
I suppose I'll answer the second one. For me, it's using you're right, Tony, the WTO is under a lot of pressure. There is some work that we are doing, and I suppose the government is doing about what needs to be done to, reform the WTO, because there are some serious issues around the pressure that's under. From our, on the other side of the business, we are looking at how we, and your point about how we also look at other ways of operating within our free trade agreements, and whether you call them something else, and how we develop those relationships, as you were saying, in those markets. So, we're looking at different ways of operating. So, we've increased the councillors around the world, but the intent is, to develop relationships and drive change, particularly around non-tariff measures, so that we can, because they're the ones that are quite often opaque compared to tariffs, and how you can actually drive that in a political context is sometimes really difficult. And your point is right about whether that's a correct rule or not, but our intent is to work with industry, and the industry is in a lot of those countries, to try and unlock those serious trade barriers.
Can I add very quickly? Sorry, I don't mean to jump in all the time. On the WTO, I genuinely believe if China won't change, then there isn't room for the US and China in the WTO. The US have openly said they'll leave if China doesn't change. And I'm not quite sure if China is going to be prepared to change. So one or the other is going to have to either significantly reform itself or exit stage left.
I think Feyi had a comment around that.
Yeah, mine comes back to this thing about how do you pick your friends in this new world order, and it's almost the same as how, as a company now, we're being asked to lift our games, where it used to be profitability, skills, experience were the characteristics that we looked for in our people, in our strategies and the like. In actual fact, we're now looking for traits and behaviours and values, and it's what's expected of us by the broader marketplace and environments we operate successfully in. So picking, instead of not necessarily relying on global institutions to create the rules, but applying to your behaviour the rules of values and traits that those global institutions have historically represented, will, I would suggest, give you a more long-term viable partnership shortlist than you would have had in the past, and overcoming the initial, as I said earlier, the initial lens of common culture, and actually talk to common values and common traits and common behaviours. They're the long-term relationships that are going to get us through and hold, longer than the superficial quick buck.
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, this is extremely controversial, but when I've heard Scott Morrison, for example, say recently that the relationship with China needs to proceed on the basis of shared values. Eating beef and cheese is not a shared value. No, it's not.
Yeah, watching football is not a shared
No,
value.
watching football is not a shared value. Maybe not putting 1 million people in a prison camp because of their ethnicity. I'm kind of hoping that's a value, but maybe that's just me being picky.
Maybe. And now someone that knows this space all too well, the Honourable Katrina Hodgkinson. It's lovely to see you here, so please take the microphone.
Thanks very much. I've got a question for you, John Colley, if that's okay. Given that you say that the future of Australia's wool exports lies firmly with Asia, following on from Michael Every's amazing TED Talk, that was just fantastic, Michael, thank you. It's sort of US versus China, just following on from those last comments. Would AWN look at different international markets if our national security comes to depend on it? Would it accept political interference or persuasion in its choice of markets?
Thanks, Katrina. Look, after I saw Michael's presentation, I thought I wanted to exit stage left, to be really honest with you.
Left being the appropriate word.
But look, this is going to come back to the commercial part of what a wool grower. If I take it back down to a very simple level of about a wool grower and what they get for returns, and the reality is, for the wool growers in the room and for everybody who has had anything to do with the wool industry has gone through over the last 2 years an enormous recovery in wool price. And the people that have driven that are the Chinese. Now, and it's pure demand internally. Now, when it comes down to the security of the country and what we do as an industry, these are questions that haven't even been thought of until we get into forums like this. If I asked any one of the 35,000 wool growers, will you give up $10 a kilo to not trade with China to protect what you have here? I don't think there is a wool grower in Australia outside this room that's probably even thought of that question. Will they have to think of it? If you watch Michael's presentation and you think about what he's had to say, the answer is probably yes. At a deeper level, I actually totally agree with Michael's presentation. I can see what's happening. I've spent a lot of time in China. I've had 32 trips to China. I'm going there next week. I don't believe anyone actually understands China. Anybody who tells me that they know what's going on in China, as far as I'm concerned, they're just a liar. You know, the reality is that they internalise everything, and when you think you've got a deal with them, that means they're ready to negotiate. When you've got a contract with them, that just means that they like you. Everything changes constantly. Will the wool industry pull away from that? Katrina, I don't think they will. I think farmers will vote with their pockets. That's what I think that they do. I think they'd sit there and go, I think you'll divide the nation, you know, and where this goes, we're in uncharted territory as far as this is concerned. You know, it scares me to hear some of the talk that, you know, if you look at everything that's we're going down the same track and we go from a Cold War to a real war. It's something in my psyche in dealing with the Chinese. And my children are 9 and 7, and by the time they're 12 and 10, they will speak fluent Mandarin. You know, so that's sort of where I think that this is all headed. And the reality of the actual how the wool grower deals with that change, or a rural person in any commodity, they vote with their dollars all the time. I think they'll choose to be. I don't think that they'll give away what they're doing in the interest of the security. I may be wrong there.
Michael.
You're probably right. And again, I'm taking an overview. I'm not trying to make any judgment on what anyone should or shouldn't do. It's my job to observe and then try and predict what that means for markets. That's what I'm paid to do. But interestingly enough, Foreign Policy magazine, which is an important US publication, not some kind of silly internet, lightweight publication, recently had an article talking about this military industrial defense strategy that the US has just put forward, which isn't agri, it's the high-tech sector that they're targeting, but it's a template, obviously for other countries and other sectors. And the headline was quite clear. It said, the US must take back corporate power, otherwise US corporations will bend the knee to Beijing. That's more or less what they said. If you operate within free trade, you will all end up bending the knee to Beijing, even though they're not free traders. And their values, as you said, their enduring values are utterly different to Australia's. So that in the US view, in Foreign Policy magazine's view, which is not left-wing at all, that will necessitate going forward from here, starting in the US, a national security strategy, quasi-mercantilism, if you will, sector by sector. And I don't know what will happen in Australia, because free trade is very dyed in the wool here, if you'd excuse the pun. No. But I wonder how long it will last. I don't know.
Yeah.
Also, in my mind, the future is we're talking about commodities when we're talking about free trade often. Your point is, the world is, agricultural services. We're going to be bigger and bigger in that. We're obviously talking about digital agriculture. So your points around, digital technology is important, just as important in the agriculture space.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, just going to put the panel on note. We're going to take our last question, and then I'll throw to you all for some closing remarks. And Feyi, I'm still interested in the brand comment you touched on earlier, because we haven't gone there. But you're all on note for a take-home message. But we do have a question right down the back with the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Lyle Howard, previous trade advisor to Andrew Robb and trade director here at the NFF many, many years ago. This is more of a comment than a question, but I want to come back to a defence of the WTO, because I don't agree with you, Feyi. The rules-based order matters enormously to a middle power like Australia. We were one of the original 23 signatories in Bretton Woods. And when It comes to global giants. Australia has been very effective as a middle power, and the Cairns Group has to be the best example. This organisation got behind the Cairns Group, formed in 1986. And when the EU and the Americans set the rules on agriculture trade in every round up until the Uruguay round, it was the Cairns Group that made achievements for agriculture. Yes, we didn't get all the way, but we made a very long strides. Now, the WTO is not free trade. The NFF has published documents for the last 25 years, many of them written by the Centre for International Economics, Dr. Andy Stokel. Termites in the Basement is a good one that we took to Seattle. We know it's not free trade, but rules matter. And what a middle power should be doing now, countries like Australia, Canada, France, Germany, the UK, we should be lobbying to defend the WTO. Our ambassador at the GATT now, Frances Lisson, is doing a great job to keep the Americans in the system. They're friendless. The only people that are talking to them in Geneva are the Australians. So she's doing an absolutely fantastic job. We have to keep doing it. And what the NFF could best do now is work with other like-minded middle powers to defend the rules-based system. We can't bully our way around the world, and we can't bribe our way around the world, and we never will. So, Feyi, I love your touchy-feely approach to the world, but rules matter, hard rules matter, and the WTO, we give up a little bit of sovereignty, and that's how it works, and we accept the rules, and I think we need to defend it, not walk away from it.
Now, I'm not sure that was a question, there was a strong statement there,
yeah.
so Feyi, right to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Lyle, and I thought you knew me better than to call me touchy-feely. I wasn't saying walk away from the rules. I'm saying find like-minded, and I mean, Global Human Rights and others will tell you at the moment that the small and medium powers are filling the gap from the US and China vacating actual moral responsibility for a whole range of things. Find like-minded partners, new partners, that you work with. And apply, when looking for who those partners are, you apply you apply your values and traits that you want reflected in those partners, rather than just expecting the game rules to dictate everyone's going to play the same way. So I'm not saying walk away from these trade agreements or WTO or all those kinds of things. I do think Australia is a little bit naive in the way it behaves in some of those forums, and expects everyone else to be as honourable and completing in contract expectations. However, more to the point, I think we need to broaden our short list of potential dance partners. And it's not just, I mean, we go back to Canada, we go to New Zealand, we go to all these people who look a lot like us, and we have to accept that there's a lot of people out there who are very similar in their attitudes to how the world should operate, who don't look a lot like us.
All right, so I'm going to have to step in on that one, but thank you for the question, remark and response. So 30 seconds each, quick wrap-up, take-home message for the audience. I think we've covered a lot of points here, and there's plenty more, I think, for this conversation to continue. But John, I might start with you.
Okay. I'll be the controversial one and go the other way to Michael. Don't be frightened of the future. You know, everything evolves. If we believe in the evolution of man from where we started to where we are today, we're just in an evolutionary process. And how trade develops, how different populations develop, and how the cultural diversities come together, the world becomes more one every day. So for me, the take-home message is we have a strong trading partner in China where we sell most of our products. We have a political connection we have with the US. We've got a very, very interesting period to go through, but don't walk away from China and don't be scared of it. I know it's different, but we have to be there.
Louise.
I'd only say they're probably similar in that the potential for agriculture to continue to grow is significant, and that we want the agriculture industry to thrive, and our view is diversification is important. The points that various members, my speakers across from me, are saying, which is around diversification, relationships, understanding, looking across the world and actually saying, am I just working with the same like-minded? Do I need to look for different partners? And what does that look like? What am I selling today? is that really going to be what I'm selling tomorrow, and to which countries do I think I'm going to be selling tomorrow, what product? You really need to make sure that is continually evolving in your mind, because you won't be selling what you are today to the same country tomorrow.
Thank you. Michael?
Actually, a very similar message to what we just heard. I'm optimistic about the outlook for the Australian agri-sector, absolutely. But you can't plan for the future by either looking backwards, with rose-tinted spectacles to how things used to be, or by presuming that the future is a straight line, because it isn't. If you look at any graph or chart of any data series for the price of anything, you see very few straight lines. They go up and down, and it's quite messy at times. And we're going to be heading for a messy period. But if Australia is forward-facing and proactive, rather than just, clinging to textbooks of how things ought to be done, which is frankly a bit religious in my view, and that doesn't really do too well in the long run for how the world really is. There's a bright future for it, but you've got to be proactive. And in like what you just said, Feyi, India plays cricket, by the way. There's quite a shared value there as far as I can see.
On that point, Feyi?
Yeah, based on the fact you might like cricket.
Actually, I don't. I hate the game.
Oh, good.
No,
good.
I hate the game.
It's not a
I
shared
don't
value.
understand. I'm working class. In the UK, working class people don't play cricket. It's a posh man's game.
Oh, there you go. That could change too. So my takeaway on this is I agree with the embrace disruption, because it is the new reality. However, I think there is, for a small nation like Australia, we have to play to our strengths, and one of our strengths is the ability to actually be unified in how we present to the world, and I started talking about it before. I do think there is a role for a brand Australia, and it's not a logo. It's something that reflects our quality of what we produce for the world, and our values. And everybody has watched in awe of what the New Zealanders have done, and are very, I think, respectful of what the Brits have achieved. And we are too small to continually play a disconnected, non-unified game on the global front. I think there's a lot of benefits around a national brand, and I think Austrade's still trying to get there.
Well, there again. But I think, we've come from trade war to Cold War. I think some topics there around sustainability, playing for the long term. This isn't a short sprint. It definitely is a marathon, being here in a sporting facility. And I think that point on brand, and for those in the 2030 Leaders Program that haven't spoken with Feyi, I think you've got a prime opportunity to grab her as she walks off the stage. And Feyi, they're sitting on that table, most of them just there, so don't run away. But I think the key message there is don't fear the future. And I think when we put the target of $100 billion by 2030 out there, this industry isn't fearful of working to achieve that. But there is work to be done in partnership between industry and government. So I think that's been a wonderful discussion, so please join me in thanking the panel.
Perfect. And thank you very much, Georgie, for just wrapping up that last session. It saves me having to do it. But nothing, cheers. Nothing is, it's really lovely seeing a panel where people can have robust discussions, sometimes differences of opinion, but that's how we all learn. So you can pick sort of what you want out of that conversation. And there was many things that I picked, but in the essence of time and with Georgie summing up, we'll move on.